A question here for you, DA, from Chris McKee at KRQE News 13. Going back to the decrease in felony litigation initiated in 2020. Is the decrease because just less crime happening in the county, or is there another reason like work from home efforts and changes in court availability or grand jury efforts make it harder to file the litigation?
No, it's a great question from Chris. The short answer is it has to do with the complete elimination of the grand jury. And again, and I want to make this clear, I support the cancellation of the grand jury during the COVID pandemic. I don't disagree with that at all. But what it does is it paints a pretty stark picture for what a community and what a justice system looks like when you eliminate the grand jury, because every felony case now must be initiated by a preliminary hearing. Those preliminary hearings are full evidentiary hearings. What that means is that no essential witness can be unavailable. A victim can't be unavailable, an eyewitness can't be unavailable, a police officer can't be unavailable, and shockingly, if a defendant makes himself unavailable, which you can imagine they have a little bit of an incentive to make themselves unavailable, I can't start my case. And that is purely a function of the rules for preliminary hearings. We have submitted proposed changes to the preliminary hearing, which would bring them into alignment, for example, with federal practice. The Supreme Court has not responded in any way, has not taken up that rule change. As far as I know, hasn't even referred the rule change to the rule committee. And that's, within the power and discretion of the Supreme Court. What I will say is that if we don't have a rule change in prelims, when we're on the other side of the pandemic and receiving vaccinations and hopefully getting the world back to some sense of normal, we have to restore the grand jury. There aren't enough police officers, there aren't enough prosecutors, and guess what? There aren't enough judges to actually feed this volume of cases into that system and actually get back to the number of felony cases that we need to start. So it's going to be something that either is resolved by a rule change or the restoration of the grand jury once the pandemic is done.
And I assume that fear of COVID is a legitimate reason for a witness to miss a hearing. I assume you hear that all the time.
Well, what we've seen, now we're doing remote hearings. So we don't even do in-person preliminary hearings. So we've actually had, I think, what's interesting is COVID has provided an opportunity for us to kind of explore how different things might work under different circumstances. We have, I think, a lower rate of police officers and victims who are unable to attend because they don't have to physically come to court. The problem is, if we have defendants not showing up, it doesn't really matter that, if we can't proceed with a preliminary hearing because the defendant has not bothered to show up, hasn't been detained, then we're just stuck. And what that really means is the evidence goes stale, eyewitnesses move away, police officers change agencies. And so we wait until that defendant gets picked up on a bench warrant, because that's what happens. They fail to show up for a preliminary hearing, even a remote preliminary hearing. A bench warrant is issued. There is no comprehensive system to go and sweep up defendants who fail to show up for court. Our police agencies are too small. We don't have the manpower. So what usually happens is we wait for this person to get pulled over in a traffic stop, and that officer in that reactive moment says, "Oh, you have a warrant out for your arrest." Then we put him back into custody. Then we try to launch the case again. But until that happens, we're kind of stuck.
Okay. Thus fewer initiations this year.
Yeah.
Terry Cole, I think you have a question.
I do. Thank you, Kyle. So DA Torrez, as we all do our jobs day in, day out, there are things that just keep us up at night. What's yours?
I would say that it used to be the rules on detention, but I don't have much control over that. But what really keeps me up at night is what you heard from that young woman, and what she endured in a pretrial witness interview. It's not right. It's not right to do that to children, and it's not right to do that to victims. And so when I go home at night, I'm trying to just sort of let go of the day and I'm hanging out with my kids, I can't help but think about what it would do to me and what it would mean to me to have one of my children or somebody that I love in my family or a friend to have to go through that. And to know that it isn't part of the justice, it isn't something that is a natural or normal part of the justice system anywhere in the country. And we have the power to fix it. The question is, do we have the political will to fix it? So that's what keeps me up at night. And it's also why this is the kind of job that wears you out. And I'm reminded of that when I look at the pictures that I think the chamber put up of my first couple years in office, and I had a lot less gray in my beard and a lot less gray on top. But it's also what motivates me to do the job.
Well, you look distinguished.
Well, let me follow up with that regarding detention. I mean, why is it that our state judiciary and our legislature are more conservative regarding detention than other states? I mean, it seems like an obvious fix for us. I mean, we continue to lead the country or be near the top of the country with our crime rates, and that, to me, seems and feels like a fairly obvious fix.
Yeah, I mean, there was a long process. There was a committee that was formed on it. There was data that was shown from an independent report. I think a lot of that data was frankly flawed data, in part because we were looking at, well, there wasn't a high recidivism rate of the individuals who were released, and what that does is what they're actually looking at is, were they arrested for something? Not whether they committed a new crime, but whether they were arrested for something. And I think if you understand the really low clearance rates for aggravated assault and aggravated burglary, you start to understand that, well, we're actually not catching most of these folks. But what is surprising to me is states like California, which, they're traditionally viewed as pretty liberal or progressive states. Even California has presumptions for when you use a firearm, we're going to keep you in jail. Or if you've already committed another felony and you commit another one, we're going to keep you in jail. And we're not going to, New Mexico in the judiciary has made a decision not to do that. I continue to be surprised by the fact that the legislature doesn't want to take it up, but that is what it is. And so my focus is on victim legislation and on protecting those kids and protecting those adult, mostly sexual assault survivors, from having to relive their trauma. There are lots of things that we need to fix in the system, and I think that's a pretty it's hard to watch that young woman's account and not think about your own friends and family and wonder why we are doing that to New Mexico's children. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Another question from Nancy Laughlin at KOAT. Can you talk more about the number of homicides this year?
Yeah, so and I'm going off of the recent reports that I saw. I know it's a constant, unfortunately, an ever-changing number as each day goes by, but we are more or less on track with last year. I think we are just below the pace that was set last year. I think there was a hope, frankly, that when one of the silver linings in the COVID pandemic would be that we would see this reduction in violent crime. Not only here, but across the country. And that just hasn't been borne out by the data. And there really is only one way to get through this, and that is to get law enforcement and police and prosecutors and the courts focus like a laser on those small groups of individuals who are overwhelmingly responsible for prevented, violent crime. And there are a number of straightforward things that we can do to address that situation, from resource investments to new technologies, new strategies, and new rules. But you need collective action, and you don't have that kind of collective action just yet from the stakeholders and leaders in the community.
Okay. Let's see. Question from Bruce Stidworthy, kind of following up on the bill that you're going to propose to protect childhood victims. Does that bill have a sponsor yet? And what is the rationale for those who might oppose this legislation?
Well, I will take the second part first, and that is simply to say I can't tell you what the rationale would be for most folks to see it. I can tell you that the criminal defense attorneys in this state conflate this process and say, well, you will often hear people say, well, we have a right to confront witnesses. And that is absolutely true. But in every other, or not every other state, I think 47 out of 50 states, that right to confront a witness occurs at trial. It doesn't occur outside of the presence of a jury or a judge. And you got to remember too, that by the time they're doing these witness interviews, one of these children is usually disclosed to a friend, a parent, a teacher, and a law enforcement officer. So those statements that have been given to those other individuals, those are already been given over to defense attorneys. So they have ample information for which to prepare for cross-examination. So we'll see. I am working with a number of members of the legislature to see who is the best and most appropriate sponsor in both the House and the Senate. But that's still sort of a work in progress. I think we'll have more to say about that probably next week.
Okay. Regarding property crime, it is trending in the right direction. It's trended down fairly steadily since 2017, which is good news. But what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think property crime is it's a much easier nut to crack in terms of your strategic approach. So take for example motor vehicle theft. You can flood a part of the community or coordinate different sort of traffic rotations and just run license plates and check for stolen cars and do those sorts of things. It's a very it relies on manpower, and then once you've identified a greater number of these individuals, we've worked with our law enforcement partners to start to strengthen the cases once they come over, and then sort of ratchet up those repeat offenders. Violent crime is a much more difficult thing because that you're not fishing for a big group of individuals who are pretty easy to identify. This is more a needle in a haystack. We know where the needles are. We know where the haystack is. We just have to get people oriented and focused in the right direction. And that's what we're doing now increasingly with folks. But it's going to take a lot more concentrated effort and frankly, more investigative and specialized units in our police departments to tackle that head on.
Okay. Well, DA Torrez, thank you. There are several more questions, but I'm going to cut that off just because we've got some time constraints. But really, really appreciate your time this morning.